The diplomatic hall of the Ziwari trade hub shimmered under the glow of bioluminescent panels embedded in the ceiling. Ethan Carter, one of humanity's few representatives in the Galactic Union, maneuvered through the gathering with practiced ease, his sharp navy blue uniform standing out amidst the iridescent robes and armored exoskeletons of alien dignitaries. He had spent the past 6 months navigating the labyrinth of interspecies politics, learning the delicate nuances that defined each race's customs. But nothing had prepared him for the Ziwari. They were tall, imposing beings, reptilian in structure yet strangely elegant. Their bodies were sheathed in smooth obsidian scales, their piercing golden eyes betraying nothing of their thoughts. Even among them one stood apart. Commander Saria Velkar was a figure of silent authority, her movements crisp, deliberate, each step carrying the weight of military discipline. Ethan had been briefed on the Ziwari's strict societal hierarchy, but the depth of their cultural rigidity only became apparent when he witnessed the careful ceremonial distance they maintained from one another. Their interactions were a choreography of measured space, an unspoken agreement that proximity was not to be breached without cause. It was an elegant dance of respect and restraint, one Ethan observed with admiration, until with a single misstep he shattered it entirely. He had been reaching for a glass of deep amber liquid from a server's tray when the shoulder of his uniform brushed against Saria's arm. The contact was fleeting, barely perceptible to human sensibilities. Yet, in the silence that followed, it might as well have been an explosion. A hush fell over the hall. Conversations faltered, movements stilled. A dozen pairs of golden eyes locked onto him with a mixture of horror and disbelief. Even the Ziwari server, frozen mid-step, averted his gaze as if unwilling to witness what would come next. Saria herself had gone rigid. Her clawed fingers curled at her sides, her chest rising and falling in slow, controlled breaths. For a moment Ethan thought she might strike him. But when she spoke, her voice was quieter than he expected, though no less lethal. "You touched me." The words carried weight as if pronouncing an inevitable sentence. Ethan blinked. It was an accident. I didn't mean to." "You touched me without permission," she continued, her golden eyes narrowing. "Do you understand what that means, human?" A sharp intake of breath came from the Ziwari surrounding them. A figure in deep crimson robes stepped forward, an official judging by the ceremonial markings on his sleeves. He examined Ethan as if he were something vile tracked onto the pristine floors of the hall. "The law is clear," the official intoned. "Uninvited contact is a declaration of intent. By our customs, you have claimed the commander as your mate." Ethan felt the words before he fully processed them, his pulse kicking up with a sudden, icy dread. "Wait, what? That's insane. It was an accident. A misunderstanding. The law does not recognize accidents." The official's gaze flicked to Saria. "Commander, do you acknowledge this claim?" A muscle in Saria's jaw tightened. She cut herself off, inhaling deeply. When she turned her gaze back to Ethan, there was something darker in her expression, something calculating. Ethan had been in tense situations before, negotiations on volatile colony worlds, bar brawls in low-gravity outposts, but nothing quite like this. His mind raced for a solution, an argument, some precedent that would release him from this absurdity. "There has to be a way to contest this," he said, shifting his stance. "A legal appeal, a clause, something." The official inclined his head, almost pitying. "You have 2 choices, human. Accept the bond and fulfill the obligations of the mating contract, or reject it, and face the consequences of dishonoring a Ziwari elite." Ethan didn't need a translator to understand that consequences in this context meant something severe. Saria exhaled sharply, and for the first time since the incident her expression shifted, irritation warring with something else. "This is a disgrace," she muttered, her voice low but lethal. "I will not be forced into anything. Neither will I." Ethan shot back, exasperation creeping into his tone. "I don't even know you. You don't even like me." Something flickered in her gaze, but it was gone before he could decipher it. The official cleared his throat. "As per our traditions, the bonding period must be observed. You will have time to determine compatibility before the final ruling. Until then, you are to remain together under diplomatic supervision." Ethan wanted to argue. He wanted to demand to speak to someone, anyone, who would listen to reason. But reason, it seemed, was a foreign concept in Ziori law. Saria's glare was sharp enough to cut steel. You have no idea what you've just done, human. Ethan let out a humorless laugh, rubbing a hand down his face. Believe me, lady, I wish I didn't. The gathered crowd began to murmur as the tension slowly diffused, but the damage was done. Whatever diplomatic efforts Ethan had been making were now secondary to the whirlwind he had been swept into. He had come to the Ziori homeworld as an envoy of peace. Now he was something else entirely. Ethan sat rigidly in the diplomatic suite assigned to him and Saria, his mind cycling through every possible way out of this absurd situation. The Ziori had been clear. He and Saria would remain together for the duration of the bonding period, during which they would either prove their compatibility or face the repercussions of rejecting the law. He had argued, protested, even tried appealing to the human embassy, but the response was the same. Ziori customs took precedence, and any further defiance would only escalate tensions between their species. Across the room, Saria stood with her arms crossed, her sharp golden eyes never leaving him. The tension between them was palpable, a crackling charge in the air. If he hadn't been thrown into this mess, Ethan might have appreciated the irony. He had spent years studying alien cultures, learning their nuances, yet one careless moment had unraveled everything. You fidget like a hatchling, Saria remarked coolly. Ethan exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. Forgive me if I'm not handling my forced engagement with grace. Her eyes narrowed. You speak as though I wanted this. Oh, believe me, I know you didn't. You've made that painfully clear. Saria's jaw tensed. There was something unreadable in her gaze, something beyond anger. He had expected fury, disgust, outright rejection. But what he hadn't expected was this careful restraint, as if she were holding back something far more complicated. After a long silence, she finally spoke. The law is the law. But do not think for a moment that I will accept this farce. I have spent my life earning my place in the Zyri elite. I will not have it compromised by a human who stumbled into a fate he does not understand. Ethan sat forward. Then help me find a way out of this. Saria's expression darkened. You assume there is one. There has to be. He gestured vaguely. What about your laws? You're a high-ranking officer. Surely you have the authority to challenge this. The law is absolute, she said, her voice clipped. Even for me. Frustration gnawed at him. The Ziori prided themselves on their rigid structure, their unyielding traditions, but surely there had to be exceptions. Then what's the alternative? We just pretend to get along until some council decides our fate. Saria's silence was answer enough. Ethan sighed, leaning back in his chair. So, what exactly does this bonding period entail? Are we supposed to go on romantic walks? Share deep, meaningful conversations? Saria's tail flicked once, a sharp sign of irritation. It is a period of observation. We are to demonstrate whether this pairing is viable. And if we fail? Saria hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the window overlooking the alien cityscape. Then the dishonor falls upon me. Ethan frowned. What does that mean? For a moment she didn't answer. Then quietly she said, my rank. My future. It would be forfeit. Something in her tone shifted the air between them. Ethan had assumed this was just as inconvenient for her as it was for him, but it was more than that. If this union was dissolved the wrong way, it wouldn't just be a bureaucratic nightmare. It would cost her everything. He rubbed his temples. Great. So if I mess this up, I ruin your life. No pressure. Saria gave him a withering look. Do not flatter yourself, human. You are merely an obstacle to be endured. Ethan chuckled dryly. Charming. For a long time neither of them spoke. The weight of the situation pressed between them, an unspoken agreement that neither wanted this, yet neither could escape it. Outside, the twin moons of the Ziori homeworld cast pale light over the towering spires of the city. It should have been a breathtaking sight, but all Ethan could focus on was the silent figure standing across from him, arms crossed, watching him like a puzzle she couldn't solve. Eventually, Saria exhaled sharply. We must make this work. Ethan looked up. What? For the duration of this period, we must present the illusion of compliance. Her voice was measured, but there was an edge to it, a note of unwilling compromise. The council will be watching. If we fail their test, the consequences will be worse than mere inconvenience. Ethan hesitated. You mean worse than exile or imprisonment? Saria's gaze hardened. I mean war. A cold knot formed in his stomach. He had assumed this was just a cultural misunderstanding, a bureaucratic headache. But if the Ziwari viewed his rejection as an insult to one of their elite, it wouldn't just be his problem. It could spark an interspecies conflict. He exhaled, forcing himself to meet her gaze. All right. We fake it. Saria nodded once, sharp and decisive. You will follow my lead. Ethan arched a brow. See, that's the thing. I'm not great at following orders. A ghost of something, amusement, flashed across her face before vanishing beneath the hardened mask of duty. Then learn quickly, human. Ethan had the distinct feeling that this was only the beginning. Ethan had never been good at pretending. It was a skill diplomats were supposed to master. Yet here he was, locked in an elaborate performance with a woman who clearly despised his existence. Their every move was monitored. Subtle glances from Ziwari officials, quiet whispers whenever they passed. They dined together, attended diplomatic functions side by side, and endured questions meant to gauge the strength of their bond. At first it had been unbearable. Saria treated him like an inconvenience, and he returned the sentiment with equal stubbornness. Every conversation was clipped, every interaction forced. But as the days stretched on, something began to shift. It wasn't a grand revelation or a single moment of clarity, just a slow unraveling of preconceptions. Ethan saw it in the way Saria's rigid posture eased when they weren't being observed. In the way she stopped correcting every minor breach of etiquette he made, as if realizing he would never fully grasp the nuances of her culture. He caught glimpses of exhaustion behind her sharp exterior, an understanding that she wasn't just a warrior, not just a figure of authority, but someone carrying the weight of expectations he couldn't begin to fathom. One evening, as they returned from yet another formal event, Ethan broke the silence. What happens if we pass their test? Saria didn't look at him immediately. Her golden eyes remained fixed on the city stretching beneath them, the skyline awash in deep indigo hues. Then the union is recognized. You become my mate in truth. Ethan exhaled. And if we fail? Her fingers curled at her sides. You return to your people. I lose my standing. And the insult of this entire affair will remain in Ziwari history. There it was again, that quiet, restrained bitterness. It wasn't just duty that held her in place. It was the fear of what failure would mean, not just for her but for everything she had worked toward. He leaned against the railing, studying her profile. You really love this life, don't you? She turned to him, something unreadable flickering in her gaze. It is not a matter of love. It is a matter of purpose. Ethan nodded slowly. That's where we're different. I never had much of a plan. Just took the next opportunity that made sense. Saria scoffed. That explains your lack of discipline. He smirked. And your inability to relax explains why you're wound so tight all the time. To his surprise, her expression softened. It wasn't quite a smile, but the tension in her shoulders lessened. You're not what I expected. Good or bad? She studied him for a moment before turning away. Undecided. For the first time since this ordeal had begun, Ethan felt something other than frustration. He wasn't sure if it was understanding or something more dangerous, something he wasn't ready to name. The next day their test came in the form of a challenge. It was a Ziwari tradition, a final trial for those whose unions were in question. They would fight, not to harm, not to win, but to prove they could endure together. The moment Ethan stepped onto the training ground, he knew he was at a disadvantage. The Ziwari were built for combat, their reflexes honed from birth. Saria, in particular, moved with lethal grace, her every motion controlled and efficient. The council watched from a raised platform, their expressions unreadable. This was no simple display. It was a measure of trust, of synchronization. Ethan knew he couldn't match Saria's speed or strength, but he could read people. And right now, Saria needed him to be more than a stubborn human thrown into her world. She attacked first, her movements swift, testing. He dodged, barely, his heart hammering. You could at least pretend to hold back. She smirked. That would be an insult. He countered, clumsy but determined. The fight was a dance, a clash of instincts, hers sharpened by years of discipline, his guided by sheer adaptability. And for the first time he understood what this was really about. It wasn't about strength. It was about trust. So he did something reckless. He dropped his guard. Saria hesitated for the briefest of moments, her instincts warring with reason. And in that instant he caught her wrist, turning her momentum against her, flipping her onto the mat. The silence that followed was deafening. Then laughter. Soft at first, then full and unrestrained. Saria lay beneath him, eyes bright with something other than calculation. Clever. Ethan grinned, breathless. Had to prove I'm worth keeping around. The council deliberated for hours after that, but Ethan already knew their answer. By the time the ruling was announced, Saria stood beside him, her presence no longer a force of resistance but something steadier, something almost familiar. She looked at him, expression unreadable. This changes things. Ethan exhaled, a slow smile tugging at his lips. Yeah. I think it does. Ethan had expected relief when the council's decision was finally announced, but instead, all he felt was a strange, uneasy weight settling in his chest. The ruling was clear. Their bond was recognized. They had passed the test. He wasn't being sent back to Earth in disgrace. Saria wouldn't lose her rank. Yet as the ceremonial proceedings concluded and the gathered officials dispersed, he found himself standing beside her in the quiet aftermath, uncertain of what came next. Saria's expression was unreadable, her golden eyes fixed ahead as if she, too, was grappling with the reality of what had just happened. The tension that had defined their every interaction had not disappeared, but it had changed. It no longer felt like resistance, no longer the rigid wall of opposition they had both been holding onto so fiercely. So, Ethan said after a long silence, shoving his hands into his pockets. That's it then? We're officially bonded. Saria exhaled sharply. The council has acknowledged our compatibility. The law considers us mates. The word made something tighten in his chest. It was strange hearing it spoken so plainly. A concept that had once been an absurdity, an inconvenience, now felt like something else entirely. Ethan chuckled dryly. Well, that's one hell of a diplomatic success story. Accidental touch turns into interspecies marriage. That'll look great in the history books. Saria turned to him then, and to his surprise, there was no anger in her gaze. No resentment. Just something quieter, something cautious. It does not have to mean anything beyond what we choose. He frowned slightly. And what do we choose? Her gaze lingered on him for a moment before she looked away. For now we maintain the illusion. The council will continue to observe. If we wish to avoid further complications, we must act as if this bond is real. Ethan nodded slowly, though the words felt heavier than they should have. Right. So, more public appearances, more playing the happy couple. Saria's lips twitched slightly. Happy is not a requirement. Believable is. Ethan smirked, but the humor didn't quite reach his eyes. Believable, huh? And what about when no one's watching? She hesitated, and in that pause he saw the same uncertainty that had been gnawing at him since the council's decision. This wasn't just about duty anymore. The lines they had drawn were blurring, shifting into something neither of them had fully prepared for. I do not know, she admitted finally. But we will figure it out. There was something reassuring in her tone, something that made Ethan's chest loosen just a little. He had spent so much time trying to fight this situation to find a way out, but now that the choice had been made, now that they had both committed to this path, maybe it wasn't just a trap. Maybe it wasn't just a mistake. They stood there for a long moment, the air between them charged with unspoken things. Then with a quiet exhale, Saria turned toward the exit, her usual sharp composure settling back into place. Come, she said. We have much to prepare for. Ethan followed without argument. Whatever this was, wherever it led, he wasn't walking this path alone. Ethan had always assumed that once the council made their decision, the worst of the ordeal would be over. He had been wrong. If anything, the scrutiny on him and Saria had only intensified. Their every interaction was analyzed, their every movement weighed against the expectations of what a true bond should look like. The Ziwari had no patience for half measures. If he and Saria faltered even once, it would not just be their reputations on the line, it would be the fragile peace between their species. He wasn't sure when the act had started feeling less like an act. Maybe it had happened gradually, slipping into the spaces between forced conversations and reluctant cooperation. Maybe it was the way Saria had stopped correcting his posture every time they stood together, or how she had started looking at him as something other than an inconvenience. Or maybe it was the quiet moments, the ones no one else saw, The way her gaze lingered on him when she thought he wasn't paying attention, or the way her voice softened just slightly when they weren't performing for the council's watchful eyes. Not that they had much time for quiet moments. The days following the ruling had been a whirlwind of diplomatic engagements, strategic meetings, and training sessions that left Ethan sore in places he hadn't even known could hurt. Ziori culture demanded strength, and while he would never match their physical prowess, he had come to realize that their people respected perseverance. He was learning slowly how to hold his own, not just in combat but in their rigid hierarchy of dominance and deference. Saria, for her part, never let him falter. When he stumbled, she was there to steady him. When he faltered in protocol, she corrected him without condescension. She pushed him harder than anyone else, but somewhere along the way he had stopped resenting it. One evening, after a particularly grueling training session, they found themselves alone in the sparring hall. The usual audience of officials and observers had long since departed, leaving only the dim glow of the overhead lights and the lingering scent of sweat and ozone from energy weapons. Ethan sat on the mat, breathing hard, while Saria stood over him, arms crossed. "You are improving," she admitted, though her tone carried the barest hint of reluctance. He smirked, running a hand through his damp hair. "Was that a compliment? From you?" She rolled her eyes, but there was no true annoyance in her expression. "Do not grow arrogant. You are still far too slow," Ethan groaned. "It's called pacing myself. Humans don't have the luxury of boundless endurance." Saria shook her head, but instead of another sharp remark, she sank down beside him. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the distant hum of the facility's ventilation system. Eventually Ethan broke the quiet. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't?" He hesitated, then gestured vaguely. "Touched you?" Saria was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. "I would not have questioned anything." Ethan turned to look at her, surprised by the admission. "I had a path. A future I had built with purpose," she continued, her golden eyes distant. "If you had not disrupted it, I would have continued forward, unchallenged." He exhaled, leaning back on his hands. "Do you regret it?" Another pause. Then finally she said, "I do not know." Ethan let out a dry chuckle. "Well, that makes two of us." She glanced at him then, something unreadable flickering across her face. "You adapt," she observed. He arched a brow. "Was that another compliment?" Saria huffed. "You mistake my words for praise." But there was no real bite to her tone. Ethan grinned, but the humor faded as he studied her expression. There was something unspoken between them, something fragile and uncertain. He wasn't sure what it meant, wasn't sure if he even wanted to name it yet. But for the first time since this mess had begun, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't fighting against this anymore. And maybe neither was she. Ethan hadn't realized how quickly routine could become comfort. What had once been an unbearable arrangement, an absurd entanglement dictated by an alien legal system, had settled into something almost natural. He and Saria still had their moments of friction, still found ways to challenge each other, but the sharp edges had softened. Their interactions no longer felt like an act performed for the benefit of watchful Ziori eyes. The problem was he wasn't sure when that shift had happened. The days blurred together, filled with training, diplomatic obligations and late-night strategy discussions. Ethan had started to understand the Ziori not just as warriors but as a people bound by a rigid yet deeply ingrained sense of honor. They valued strength, but not just in the physical sense. It was about endurance, about proving oneself capable of standing firm under pressure. He had earned more than just wary tolerance. He was beginning to sense something dangerously close to respect from the Ziori elite. Saria had changed too, though she would never admit it. Her rigid demeanor hadn't softened, not exactly, but there was a difference in the way she carried herself around him. She no longer corrected his every misstep with exasperation. Instead, she had begun to trust him to figure things out on his own. When she watched him, it was no longer with irritation but something more measured. One evening they found themselves alone in the quarters they now shared. The space had been arranged for efficiency rather than comfort, a blend of Ziwari architecture and hastily adapted human accommodations. Ethan sat on the edge of the room's single long bench, idly running a hand over his bruised knuckles. Training had been more intense than usual. Saria had pushed him harder, testing limits neither of them had acknowledged before. Saria stood by the window, arms folded, watching the city below. The soft glow of the skyline cast shadows across her features, highlighting the sharp lines of her expression. He was thinking he recognized that look by now. "You're quiet," he noted, breaking the silence. She didn't turn. "I have been considering our position." Ethan tilted his head. "And?" She exhaled slowly. "You have adapted well. Better than I expected." He smirked. "I'll take that as a compliment." Saria's gaze flicked to him, unreadable. "Do you still resent this arrangement?" He hesitated. The answer should have been simple. Weeks ago he would have said yes without a second thought. But now. Ethan exhaled, leaning back slightly. "No. I don't." Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise exactly. More like quiet acknowledgement. "And you?" he asked, watching her carefully. She didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than he expected. "I no longer see it as a burden." The room felt smaller all of a sudden, the space between them charged with something unspoken. Ethan wasn't sure what to do with the realization, wasn't sure if he wanted to push it further. He let out a breath, forcing a lopsided grin. "Well, that's progress." Saria huffed, but there was no real irritation behind it. For the first time since this all began, Ethan wondered if this wasn't just something they were enduring. Maybe it was something they were building. Ethan had grown used to the weight of scrutiny, the constant pressure of proving himself in a world that had never been meant for him. But today the air felt different. Tighter. Charged. The council had summoned them for a formal assessment, a final review of their union to determine whether their bond would stand unchallenged. The trial they had endured before had been a test of skill, of coordination in combat. This, however, was something far more insidious, a test of loyalty, of conviction. They would not be asked to fight. They would be asked to prove what could not be easily measured. Saria walked beside him, her posture as controlled as ever, but he could sense the tension in the way her fingers curled slightly at her sides. She wasn't worried, not in the way a human might be, but she was prepared for a challenge. They entered the grand hall, the same place where their fates had been bound together weeks ago. Ziori officials lined the edges of the room, their expressions impassive, their golden eyes watchful. The High Council sat at the far end, their presence an unmoving force of authority. Ethan straightened his stance as they stopped before them. Saria did not glance at him, but he could feel her presence as solid as ever beside him. The eldest counselor, a woman named Zalith, leaned forward slightly. "You have now spent considerable time bound to one another," she began, her voice carrying the weight of judgment. "We require your final affirmation. Does this union stand?" Ethan had prepared for this moment, had rehearsed the right words in his head a dozen times. But now, as the question hung in the air, he realized something unsettling. He didn't need to lie. He turned his head slightly, just enough to catch Saria's profile. She was still as stone, but he saw the faintest movement of her throat as she swallowed. The silence stretched. The council watched. Then Saria spoke. "It stands." Her voice was steady, without hesitation. And yet there was something underneath it, something he might not have noticed before. Zalith's gaze shifted to Ethan. "And you?" He exhaled slowly. "It stands," he said. And he meant it. There was a long pause before Zalith inclined her head. "Then it is decided. The matter is settled." Just like that, it was over. As they turned to leave, the weight in Ethan's chest did not lessen. If anything, it felt heavier. Because now there was no more pretending. No more easy escape. And for the first time he wasn't sure he wanted one. The council's decision should have brought relief. The scrutiny was over, their bond acknowledged beyond dispute. Yet as Ethan and Saria stepped out of the grand hall and into the cool evening air, the weight in his chest refused to lift. The future he had once fought against was now reality, and there was no longer an exit to seek. Saria walked beside him, silent as they moved through the corridors of the compound. Normally she would have gone straight to their quarters, but tonight she veered toward the balcony overlooking the city. Ethan followed without question. The city stretched before them, bathed in silver light from Ziera's twin moons. The skyline was sharp, angular, like the people who built it. It had once felt foreign to him, an unwelcoming landscape of rigid lines and impossible expectations. Now it felt like something else entirely. Saria stood at the edge of the balcony, her arms resting lightly against the metal railing. She had removed the more formal layers of her uniform, leaving only the sleek underlayer that clung to her form, its design both practical and elegant. She looked almost at ease, but Ethan knew her well enough now to recognize the tension beneath the surface. "You're thinking," he said. She didn't glance at him, but he saw the faintest shift of her expression. "I am always thinking." He huffed a quiet laugh. "All right then. What are you thinking about now?" Saria was silent for a moment before she finally spoke. "The decision has been made. There is no turning back." Ethan leaned against the railing beside her, exhaling. "Yeah." Another pause. Then softer. "Are you certain you do not regret it?" Ethan tilted his head, studying her profile. "Why do you ask?" Saria's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "Because I do not." The words settled between them, quiet but undeniable. Ethan felt his pulse pick up slightly, though he wasn't sure why. He turned, resting his forearms on the railing, mirroring her posture. "You know," he said after a beat, "when this all started, I thought I'd spend every second trying to find a way out. And now," he trailed off, considering his next words carefully. "Now, I think maybe this isn't the worst thing that could have happened." Saria finally looked at him then, her golden eyes searching his face. "You believe that?" Ethan held her gaze. "Yeah. I do." She studied him for a long moment before nodding just once. Then she turned back to the skyline, her expression unreadable. Ethan didn't need her to say anything more. The truth was already there in the silence between them. The days following the council's ruling were quieter than Ethan expected. There were no more official tests, no more looming threats of failure. The Zeori had accepted their union, and with that acceptance came an absence of the relentless scrutiny that had once dictated their every interaction. Yet instead of relief, Ethan found himself unsettled. For so long he had defined his existence here by resistance, fighting against expectations, against the absurdity of his situation, against the idea that this bond could ever be real. Now that there was nothing left to fight, he wasn't sure what to do with himself. Saria, as always, adapted with perfect composure. She continued her training, attended her meetings, carried herself with the same discipline she always had. But there was something different in the way she interacted with him now. The sharp edges of duty had softened, replaced with something else. Not warmth, exactly. Saria was not one for sentiment, but an ease that had never been there before. One evening, Ethan found her in the training hall, moving through a set of precision drills. He leaned against the doorway, watching as she struck the practice dummy with fluid efficiency, her movements sharp and controlled. Even in something as simple as this, there was a kind of grace to her, a lethal elegance that had fascinated him from the beginning. "You ever take a break?" he asked, smirking. Saria didn't stop, didn't even glance at him as she executed her next strike. "Weakness is born of stagnation." Ethan chuckled. Right. A warrior does not rest and all that." She finished her sequence and finally turned to face him. "You mock, but you have learned more than you admit." He pushed off the wall, stepping closer. "And you're a lot less terrifying than you used to be." Saria tilted her head slightly, regarding him with something unreadable in her golden eyes. "Do you fear me less?" Ethan considered that. "I think I understand you more." For a moment they simply stood there, neither speaking. There was something in the air between them, something unspoken but undeniable. Then Saria exhaled, rolling her shoulders back. "If you seek to challenge me, then do so properly." Ethan grinned. "You want me to fight you?" She stepped forward, closing the space between them just slightly. "You wish to understand me?" she asked, voice lower now. "Then face me." Ethan's pulse kicked up, though whether from the challenge or something else he wasn't sure. But he raised his hands into a ready stance. And Saria smiled. Ethan barely had time to react before Saria moved. She was fast, faster than he'd ever get used to, and the first strike nearly caught him off guard. He ducked, pivoting on instinct, his body already conditioned to respond to her attacks. Saria didn't let up. She pressed forward, her movements precise, her strikes calculated to test his defenses without overwhelming him outright. This wasn't like their early training sessions where she had treated him as an untrained outsider. This was something different. She was challenging him, not as a reluctant participant in this union, but as an equal. Ethan grinned, adrenaline kicking in. He shifted his weight, sidestepping a low sweep and countering with a jab. She deflected it effortlessly, but he caught the flicker of approval in her gaze. They circled each other, the training hall silent except for the sound of their footfalls and the sharp breath of exertion. Ethan knew he wouldn't win. Saria had trained for combat since childhood, while he had only begun to grasp the fundamentals. But that wasn't the point. The point was that she expected him to fight. He feinted left, then pivoted suddenly, aiming for her exposed side. She anticipated it, catching his wrist in a swift motion, but instead of throwing him to the mat, she hesitated. For the briefest moment they were close, closer than they had ever been in a fight. Ethan could feel the warmth of her skin, the measured strength of her grip. Her golden eyes studied him, sharp but unreadable. Then she released him. Ethan stepped back, breathing hard. That almost felt like mercy. Saria tilted her head. You are improving. It would be a waste to end the match too quickly. He let out a breathless laugh. That almost sounded like a compliment. Saria considered him for a moment. Perhaps it was. Something unspoken settled between them. Not tension exactly. Something deeper. Ethan rolled his shoulders, smirking. All right then. Round 2. Saria's lips curled ever so slightly. And then she lunged. The moment Saria moved, Ethan reacted purely on instinct. He sidestepped her initial strike, barely avoiding the force behind it. His pulse hammered in his ears as he countered, aiming low in an attempt to disrupt her stance. But she was already ahead of him, shifting effortlessly, her movements so fluid they felt almost effortless. She struck again, faster this time. He blocked, but the impact sent a jolt through his arms. She wasn't holding back anymore. Ethan exhaled sharply, recalibrating. He couldn't win, but he could last. He could force her to keep moving, to keep engaging, and that in itself would be a victory. A grin tugged at the corner of his mouth as he dodged another strike. Is this how you flirt, or am I just special? Saria arched a brow, not pausing in her assault. Flirting requires wasted breath. I have no need for such inefficiency. Ethan barely managed to duck under her next move, laughing despite himself. Good to know. The fight continued, their movements weaving together in a rhythm that felt almost familiar now. It was no longer just about winning or losing. It was about understanding, about pushing each other to the limits of their abilities. Every strike, every counter, was a conversation neither of them was willing to end. But then Saria shifted unexpectedly, using a technique he hadn't seen before. Before he could react, she had swept his legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the mat. Ethan groaned, staring up at the ceiling. Hey, that one was new. Saria stood over him, expression unreadable. Then to his surprise she extended a hand. He hesitated for only a moment before grasping it. Her grip was firm, steady, but she didn't pull him up right away. Instead she held him there just for a second, her golden eyes searching his. Then she released him, stepping back. You are learning. Ethan pushed himself up, shaking his head with a smirk. And you're full of surprises. Saria didn't answer, but there was something in the way she looked at him. Something that hadn't been there before. Ethan wasn't sure what it meant. But he wanted to find out. The next few days passed in a strange, unspoken shift between them. Their routines remained the same. Training, meetings, fulfilling the obligations of their bond. But something had changed. The air between them carried a charge that hadn't been there before. An awareness that neither seemed willing to address outright. Ethan felt it in the way Saria's gaze lingered a fraction longer than before. In the way her presence, once an imposing force, now felt familiar. Comfortable even. He caught himself watching her during quiet moments, not in the wary way he once had, but with something else he wasn't quite ready to name. One evening he found himself standing outside their shared quarters, hesitating for a moment before stepping inside. Saria was already there, seated at the table reviewing something on her datapad. She glanced up as he entered, her expression as composed as ever, but her eyes held something softer. Ethan leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. You ever take a break from being terrifyingly efficient? Saria arched a brow. Efficiency is preferable to idleness. He smirked. Right. But what do you do when you're not conquering battle simulations or making me question my life choices in training? She considered his question for a moment before setting the datapad aside. I observe. I learn. Ethan chuckled. So even when you're resting, you're working. Saria didn't deny it. Instead, she gestured toward the chair across from her. Sit. He did, watching as she regarded him with a measured look. There was something different in her posture, in the way she seemed to weigh her words before speaking. "You have changed," she said finally. Ethan tilted his head. "For better or worse?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she studied him as if searching for something beneath the surface. "When we first met, you resisted everything. Every word, every action. You were prepared to fight until the end." He exhaled a quiet laugh. "I wasn't exactly given a choice." Saria nodded. "And yet now you no longer fight the way you once did." Ethan hesitated. He could argue, say that he was still the same person, that nothing had really changed, but that would be a lie. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but somewhere along the way he had stopped looking for an escape. Stopped seeing Saria as just an adversary in an unwanted arrangement. Somewhere along the way he had started choosing to be here. He met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. "Maybe I just realized," he said quietly, "that not everything is worth fighting." Saria held his gaze for a long moment. Then slowly she nodded. Neither of them spoke after that, but the silence was not uncomfortable. It was an understanding, one that neither of them needed to put into words. Ethan stood at the edge of the training grounds, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky above Sierra deepened into shades of violet and gold, casting long shadows over the angular structures of the city. It was a view he had seen countless times before, but tonight it felt different. Footsteps approached behind him, measured and precise. He didn't need to turn to know it was Saria. "You are thinking again," she said, coming to stand beside him. Ethan huffed a quiet laugh. "Dangerous habit, I know." Saria remained silent, waiting. She had learned, as he had, that words meant little if they were not chosen carefully. He exhaled. "I spent a long time trying to figure out how to fight this. How to find a way out. But now," he shook his head as if trying to piece together his own thoughts. "Now I don't think I want to leave." Saria's gaze shifted toward him, though her expression remained unreadable. "And what do you want?" Ethan turned to face her fully. The question lingered between them, heavier than it should have been. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But I know I don't want to fight you anymore." Saria studied him, her golden eyes sharp but not unkind. "Then what do you propose?" Ethan hesitated, not because he didn't have an answer, but because he knew the truth of it mattered. "I think we stop pretending this is just obligation," he said finally. "I think we figure out what this actually means." Saria was quiet for a long moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. It wasn't an agreement in words, but it didn't need to be. It was a beginning. The next morning, Ethan woke with the strange feeling that something had shifted, though the world around him remained unchanged. The room was the same: sleek Ziori architecture, impossibly clean lines, minimalistic functionality. The air was the same, carrying the faint metallic hum of the city's power grid. Yet beneath it all there was something different. Something that settled under his skin, not uncomfortable but undeniable. He sat up, running a hand through his hair. Across the room, Saria was already awake as he expected. She moved through a series of fluid stretches, her form balanced, precise. Even in something as simple as this, there was an efficiency to her movements, a purpose that had once seemed rigid but now felt like second nature to him. She glanced at him briefly. "You wake later than usual." Ethan smirked. "I didn't realize I had a schedule." "You have patterns," she corrected, finishing her stretch and turning toward him. "And now they are altered." He let out a soft chuckle. "Guess I have a lot to think about." Saria considered that for a moment before nodding. "As do I." She didn't elaborate, but she didn't need to. Last night's conversation lingered between them, unspoken but present. They had not made promises, not declared anything outright, but something had been acknowledged. A truth neither of them had been willing to face until now. Ethan swung his legs over the side of the bed, standing. "So," he said, stretching his arms over his head, "what happens now?" Saria studied him as if weighing the question itself. "We move forward." Ethan chuckled. "Always so direct." She stepped closer, tilting her head slightly. "Would you rather I be uncertain?" He met her gaze, something warm curling in his chest at the challenge in her voice. "No," he admitted. "I think I like you exactly as you are." For a moment there was only silence. Not the uncomfortable kind, nor the heavy kind that spoke of unresolved conflict. This was something else entirely, something balanced, steady. Then Saria nodded as if that answer was enough. And for the first time since this all began, Ethan realized he wasn't fighting anymore. He was choosing.